Sir, would you state your name?
My name is Stanley Levi Evans.
Levi Evans. Mr. Evans, I would first of all like to say thank you very much for coming. You are a part of the Black Chronicle newspaper's Black History Month celebration.
Thank you.
And we are doing, we're recording some history when it comes to Miss Clara Looper and what she meant for not only this great state of Oklahoma, but the nation and this world. And we know that you all have been a part of that, and you are carrying that lineage forward with your day-to-day, as I like to call it, ministry that you've been blessing the people who meet you. If we could, tell us about yourself. Are you a native of Oklahoma City? Tell us about yourself.
I was born in Texas, and after I lived for a couple of years, my mother and father moved back to Oklahoma City. And I came to Oklahoma City, grew up here, grew up on the east side of Oklahoma City in what was traditionally the east side, and understand that when I came to Oklahoma in 1946, this was a very, very segregated town. For the most part, we lived between 4th Street and the river. And as I was growing up, as our population and our community grew, we moved farther to to 6th Street. Then we moved north to 8th Street. Then we moved north to 23rd Street. Then they had something here called urban renewal, where they decided to put the interstate right through the middle of our neighborhood, and that is considered by some as good and some as not. We considered this kind of good because it allowed our family to get enough money out of our old house to buy a new house in a neighborhood called, lost the name, out across 50th Street. I can't think of the name of the school, the neighborhood. It'll come to me in a minute. And so what I liked about that is it happened right after I graduated from high school. Or I should say what I didn't like about it, it happened right after I graduated from high school. We lived in a house that didn't have air conditioning. We lived in a house that was, part of the neighborhood. I knew all of my neighbors. When we moved out into the new neighborhood, I'd gone to college that year, and I was upset because both my brother and my sister got the benefit of air conditioning in their house, and I didn't get that benefit. It just used to torque me off every time I came home. But at the same time, it broke up our neighborhood. It broke up our community. If you look at what was going on in our neighborhood as far as the churches, as far as the schools, all of that growing up together in that neighborhood, it went a different way. So there was a good part of it because we moved into nicer houses, we moved into nicer communities, but the bad part was that we broke up a very, 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 very tight neighborhood.
Well, first of all, you moved, I've talked to others and they talked about at one time blacks couldn't move past. They could not come north of 8th Street. So you mentioned that you went from 23rd to 50th. Mm-hmm. But you talked about college. And if I could, I'd like to just kind of come back a little bit if I could and talk about your education. What schools did you attend? What elementary school did you attend?
I attended Dunbar Elementary School, went to Moon Junior High School, which is actually Old Douglas, up on 6th and High. Then from there, we went to the New Douglas, which was on the other side of Martin Luther King. At that time, it was Eastern, other side of Eastern. I remember when I was a kid, that used to be the fairground. And we used to love the fact that it was fairground because what would happen, everybody would come over to there to go to the fair, and after the fair was over, we could go pick up coins out of the little dust on the ground, and that would give us enough money to last us 2 or 3 months.
Wow. So, do you remember how much, 2 or 3 months, what was your favorite item to eat back then, or convenience store candy or soda? What was it costing back then?
Well, candy would, basically, you had penny candy.
Penny candy.
Candy would cost a penny, and you could get gum, you could get lollipops, suckers, you could get just about any kind of candy you wanted for a penny. And what we were paying a penny for then might cost a quarter now. It's amazing to look at it and see that and laugh. It was also interesting because we had all the black churches in our community. And I remember, I don't know if you wanted me to talk about this, but I remember I was a kid when Reverend Reed came to Oklahoma City. And the pastor at Fairview Church at that time was a guy by the name of Reverend Fairley. And Reverend Fairley and his wife, we used to think his wife was one of the meanest people in America. Because when we would go to church there, if we started cutting up, she would come sit right in the middle of us and basically calm us down. But there was between our churches, there were 4 churches right together, and there was a store right in the center of it, and we would go there and get penny candy every Sunday. And normally our parents would give us some money to put in church, and we'd manage to save a little bit of it to go to the store. Then we'd figure out who was preaching where. And Reverend Reed was the junior pastor at Fairview at the time. And if Reverend Reed was preaching at Fairview, we'd go to Fairview. If Reverend Fairley was preaching at Fairview, we'd go somewhere else.
So this had to be, what, in the early 50s?
This was in the 50s, about mid-50s, between probably about 54 and 57, or 58 in there.
Okay, so you said, so let's just stick with that there. You said the neighborhood, when you moved out, it kind of broke it up, but you had 4 churches. Sound like to me, for the vision of 4 corners, church as store in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
You're part of segregation, aren't you?
Yes.
When you say it broke it up, how did it break it up? Black folks were still consolidated to one area.
Well, remind me, I need to talk about John Green, and I also need to talk about Bobby Dowell in my class and his father, Alonzo Dowell, because I need to come back to those. But basically, from our perspective, we had a tight community, which was the only place that we could live in Oklahoma City. They had 3 small communities in Oklahoma City that were African-American communities when I was a kid. And the one we used to call it the East Side was the largest. There were a couple others, and I can't remember the names right now, but there were like 3 communities. All of us were close to the river. All of us were on the other side of the railroad track. And if you start thinking about that in that kind of traditional way, that's where we were. The things that gave us pride in our community was first the Douglas High School Band. And I couldn't wait. I started learning to play instruments so that when I got up to high school, I could get in the Douglas High School Band. And nothing made me happier than when I was in the 9th grade, I went into the main band. And I stayed in the main band for 4 years. Now, we had a band director. Mr. Buford was the director when I got there. Also, F.D. Moon was the principal at Douglas when I got there. But later on, Mr. Perry was the director. And I remember
I heard that.
Our band was so tight and so well disciplined that we used to do things that the college bands used to do, like Langston and Grambling, and we copied their marches. And Mr. Perry could get us trained to do a whole new routine every week. But I remember he was also very, very big on discipline, and that caught me in a problem one time. We'd do a homecoming parade every year. And one year we were doing a homecoming parade going through the neighborhood, and I was the captain of my group of the clarinets. And so we're going there, and somebody on the neighborhood, as we're going through the neighborhood, said, "Hey, stand!" So I turned and waved at him like that. Mr. Perry turned around, looked at me, "Get out! Get out! If you want to be with them, get on the street." And that made such an impression, not only on me, but on others, because one of the things that we learned during that time was we needed to be the best at what we could be, and we needed to not let things distract us from what was important. When I was at Douglas High School, we had lots of teachers and lots of principals that were that way. I talked about the fact that F.D. Moon was there when we were there. F.D. Moon was also the superintendent of the black schools, and not in an official way, but in an unofficial way. If you wanted to get into a school in Oklahoma City and you were African American, you had to go through F.D. Moon. I remember Miss Allen, Ruth Allen, telling me a story once about how she wanted to be a principal. Miss Allen was really, really young back then. And this was before my time, because she also taught my dad. So she was telling a story about how she went to F.D. Moon and he wouldn't hire her because she was not old enough that he considered her mature enough to be a teacher. So she just kept after it and kept after it. And then she finally got somebody else to hire, and F.D. Moon almost fired her on the spot because he didn't think she should belong there. But Miss Allen rose up, and later on, I love Miss Allen because Miss Allen set the standard, her and a couple others, for the English as we were coming through. And I remember when I was in her class, I take it back, I wasn't in her class. And I was giving a presentation one day, and I was talking about what a great person Miss Allen was, and another one was Miss Parks. But I want to talk about Miss Allen right now. Miss Allen would correct you on the spot, and she had standards that you had to stand up to. So everybody feared that. So I came up in the 8th grade, and I was supposed to go to Miss Allen that year. That year, Miss Allen had a baby, so we missed her. And so we always used to talk about we were the class that Miss Allen missed, and that's why our English was so bad. And then later on, I get to Miss Parks, and because I didn't have Miss Allen, I ended up getting a D from Miss Parks in English.
It was Miss Allen's fault.
It was Miss Allen's fault. It was Miss Allen's fault. Or actually, it was Miss Allen's daughter. Her daughter's name was Nanette. It was Nanette's fault.
Okay, there you go.
But Miss Parks always remembered that she gave me that D. And I'd be getting up, giving a speech somewhere, and she'd be in the audience. She said, "I'm so proud of that boy." And I'm like, "Miss Allen," she says, "I gave him a D, and he straightened up from there." And she just, that was the time when we had PhDs and people that had traveled all over the world that were brought into the community at Douglas High School. The reason for that is a good reason and a bad reason. The good reason was that it made us as students better prepared to deal with what we were going to deal with in the world. When people ask me about what led me to having the standards that I have and being who I am, I always point back to that time at Douglas. But then I also point back to that time at Douglas as the time that we had all these great teachers there because they could have been anything they wanted, but they were locked into being teachers because they couldn't do nothing else. It blessed us, but it also at the same time held our community down. So everything, I guess, has its goods and its bad, but overall, it slowed down our community. It slowed down our level of being able to just to really go out and be what we can be. I have a story I tell about my kids. When I came out of Douglas, my parents were fantastic, but neither one of my parents had a college degree. They were just good people doing hard work. And so there was a guy there by the name of Dr. Melvin Todd. Dr. Melvin Todd became the first mentor I had in my life. Dr. Todd would stay on my case about, "Stan, you need to go to college. Stan, you need to go to college. Stan, you need to go to college." And so finally, he just kind of convinced me, so I applied and went to college. But I never would have occurred to me to even consider that if it wasn't for Dr. Todd. So I go to college, and I go to a place.
Where did you go to college?
A place on Stillwater Creek that I can't talk about because I work at another place. So I go to college, and the next thing I know, I'm flunking out of college. And I don't mean I dropped out. I mean I flunked out. They sent me a letter that said, "Do not come back. You don't belong here." The problem was, and this is what I do right now that's changed my life, is that sometimes we have to have a long-term vision. We have to have an idea of where we want to go. Dr. Todd talked me into going to college, but he didn't explain that college is a step toward a major point in life. It's not the major point. So when I went to college, since that was my goal, I had a great time at college. I enjoyed it. And the next thing I knew, I was out and in the Army. So that, to me, is part of who I am as a person. When I talk to folks now, I always talk to them about a long-term plan. I always talk to them about the steps you need to take to get there. I always talk to them about what it's about. I always talk to them about why they need mentors. But more importantly, understanding that if you can get a person to focus on understanding why it's important to do the work, they'll do better at it than if they're just there doing work. When I went to college, I was just there at college, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And if I could, I'd like to stick with that thing, you in college.
Okay.
You started off, you described a household, a family, a mom and a dad.
Mm-hmm.
You shared with us about your siblings. But you have a mom and dad, good, hard-working people.
Yes.
You went to that school up north and had a good time and came home.
Stillwater Creek.
Stillwater Creek. And you received a letter or notification that you flunked out.
Don't bother to come back.
How was that received by mom and dad?
The interesting thing was, I was so embarrassed, I didn't come back to Oklahoma City. I went and joined the Army. And I was in the Army for 2 months before my mom found out I was gone. And that's because I felt that a lot of the people in the community supported me in going to school and wanted me to go to school. And when your church has raised money to get you in college, and how do you go home and say, I blew all that? So I just went and joined the Army. Literally just went to the recruiting station right there in Stillwater and joined.
Wow. But let's stick with Stillwater Creek.
Okay.
How many blacks were there as students at that time? And what year was that?
It was less than 50.
Less than 50.
And that was I was there 1964 through 1968. I became an Alpha Phi Alpha while I was there, and we had one of the two fraternity houses west of the Mississippi River, us and the University of Kansas. And I remember we had a basement. We could have a basement and have a party down in the basement, and every African American at Oklahoma State could comfortably come in our basement and join the party. That's how few of us that there were. During the time I was there, every African American knew each other because there were so few of us, and there was just not a lot. The support system there, I think, didn't really help us the way that we try to build support systems right now. Like with me at the University of Oklahoma, I think it's absolutely important that we go out and get people into school, but it's just as important, if not more important, that we make sure we build a support system around them to understand why they're there, get them to focus, and to get them through. It's a complete waste of time to let somebody go to school and not support them so they can get through it. We have wasted a life. So I feel very strongly that what we have to do is make sure that we get people to understand why they're there, we keep them motivated, we keep them focused, and we build a support system. And a part of that support system has to be that they communicate early. With me, all this could have been fixed if I'd have had somebody to talk to early in my college career about what was going on to kind of take over from Dr. Todd when I moved to Oklahoma State, if that makes sense.
It does.
I tried to perform that function at the University of Oklahoma. That's very important to me.
Mr. Evans, you are looked upon as a dynamic stakeholder in Oklahoma City at the state.
You better call me Stan the next time.
Well, Stan, and,
Okay.
and stakeholder in Oklahoma City, the state, as well as this nation. You have served this country for many years. Your discipline is unparalleled. You are a networker of people. You said something that resonated with me. You said that you didn't want to come home because of the people that you felt like you let down.
Yes.
The church.
Yes.
The community.
Yes.
Your parents were a byproduct, because that's obvious, but you talked about community.
Mm-hmm.
In today's world, is with how great this country is today, and blacks living everywhere, is there still the same community raising blacks like it was at that time?
It should be, it can be, but I'm not sure that we're making the effort that we need to make. In an earlier conversation that I had with you today, we were talking about how important the different components are. But we need to make sure that we keep the components interconnected in such a way that people can see everywhere I go, there's a support system for me, and people have great expectations of me, which allow me to have great expectations of myself. I think that all too often, I'll give you another example. When I first got to OU College of Law, we welcomed and tried to get as many minorities as we could get there, but what we didn't do was to let them know what was expected of them. And that was one of the things I worked very, very hard to change. I wanted them to understand, number one, they were absolutely as good potentially as anyone else at the law school. And so that perception was not there before I got there. But I wanted that perception to be changed because the truth is they're absolutely as good potentially as anyone else. So the first thing is we need to build a belief in ourselves and in people they're working with that they're good.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The second part of that is that we need to get them to understand that and get them to understand they got to do the work. It's not about lowering the standard. It's about raising them up to the standard, if you follow what I'm saying. And so sometimes we're getting communities where they'll say, well, we need to do something to get them over the hump. My concern is, why on earth would I want a black substandard lawyer in my community? Why on earth would I want that? So why don't I do what I can in school to make sure that the lawyers we got measure up to the standard, in fact, higher than the standard? And so we have to continuously preach that and get them to believe that. It's about getting people to believe that they are as good. Many, many times I talk to minorities at OU Law and elsewhere, and they're like, well, I don't know if I can do it. And people keep telling me I don't belong here. And I'm like, if you're here, you belong here. And even if you didn't belong here at first, you belong here now. And so do the work because you're capable of doing it. That, to me, starts out with one, we have to give people an ironclad belief that they're in the right place at the right time, and then they have to do the work to get to where they need to get to the next level. Something else I think is important, and this is what I really stress and push down, is it's about connections. When I talk to people now, especially when I talk to my students, it's very, very important for me that I find them mentors out there in the community that are already successful. I've heard this phrase many times, and I'm absolutely a believer in it. You can only become what you can see. So therefore, if I only see this, what's inside this little, my hands right here, that's about all I'm going to become because I don't know any better. So we need to expose people to where they can see the larger world and see the opportunities that are out there. Like I'll talk to a student and they'll tell me, well, I want to be a lawyer so I can help this person or this kid I saw in the community that needed a lawyer. I want to be that lawyer that can help them. I'm like, why don't you want to be a lawyer so you can be the director of the public health system of the state of Oklahoma? Why don't you be a lawyer so you can direct the health community for the entire country? Those are the places we need you. Yeah, we need you in these places too, but we need you to have a sense of large and the fact that you can impact at a large level, not just at a very, very small level. That's another way that we need to change the way we think as a community, and we need to change to open doors in such a way that people can see that the door is open, and then number two, that we prepare them so when they go through the door, they'll be ready for what they come across.
You've had a dynamic career. Would have never thought that you flunked out of college. You will have, and we will get to the exact, but you've been a colonel in the U.S. Army. You have been and still a dean, School of Law of University of Oklahoma. I know you're retired from both capacities, but you're still active in the School of Law. You have had success. You've had success that someone can visually see. You've had success that people can touch. We talked earlier, those things are paramount for young people who look like you to know that they can reach those same goals, those same success. But rewinding all the way back, it starts at home, correct?
It starts at home.
Starts at home. Starts at home, and then during your matriculation of life of a young person, 1958. How old were you in 1958?
I was 11 years old.
11 years old. And when did you meet, or when were you first exposed or met Miss Claire Looper?
I met Miss Looper, I guess I've always known Miss Looper. I lived on 9th Street. Miss Looper lived on Park. And if you follow Oklahoma City, there's 9th Street, 10th Street, and Park Street. So we, for lack of a better term, Ms. Looper's been one of the mothers in the neighborhood who had the liberal authority to spank your butt if she saw you doing something. So Ms. Looper is taking a wire to my behind, so we leave it at that. That's how far back we go. But it's interesting when you start thinking about people in the community, which I got to stop and go somewhere else real quick. Ms. Looper was effective first and foremost in the sit-ins because people in our community trusted her with their kids. Does that make sense?
I don't know if I could give my 11-year-old to a movement.
Yes.
I just don't know if I could.
You hit the nail on the head. There were times when my mother was scared to death. And being 11-year-old, fear of stuff like that really wasn't in my psyche. Sure. If an adult told you to do something, you just went and did it. But Miss Looper, first and foremost, the parents believed in her. They trusted her with their kids. And that was, to me, the energy, or I should say the engine that drove our civil rights movement. Things Ms. Looper would do. And I'm going to talk probably about a couple other people. I'm going to talk about Joyce Henderson, who was my cousin and my classmate. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Marilyn, who was in my class as well. Marilyn went to Washington, D.C. and New York with her mother when they did a play called Mr. President. When Marilyn was up there, Marilyn saw all of these places where we could go and eat, all these hotels that you could stay at, all these issues that we didn't have to deal with in Oklahoma and the South. So Marilyn is kind of one of these people that when she sees something she doesn't like, it's coming out of her mouth real fast. So they came back to Oklahoma, and we were sitting in Marilyn's front yard one day, or Miss Looper's front yard one day, and that's where we used to have our NAACP youth council meetings from time to time. And so we're sitting there, and Miss Looper, Marilyn is going off. Why is it we have to come back to Oklahoma and put up with this nonsense? Blah, 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 blah. Marilyn is like that. She'll just start on a rant. And so Maryland was on one of her rants about this is unsatisfactory. Oklahoma shouldn't be like this. It needs to be like it is in Washington. It needs to be like it is in New York. Why do we have to put up with these substandard whatevers? So Ms. Luper says, you guys want to fix this? And of course, Maryland leading us said, of course we do. So what happened then is Ms. Luper says, okay, we need to be organized, we need to be trained, and start to build how we're going to do. One of the things I loved about Ms. Luper is it's important sometimes to be an activist and point out problems. But it's more important that as you're pointing out the problem, let's point out what the solution is going to be and what the end state is that we expect. Our end state is that we wanted to be able to eat at these restaurants when we felt like we wanted to, the same way as everyone else. So Ms. Luper says, here's how we do this. We're going to use kids. We chose to use kids because the whites were much less likely to be violent toward a child than they would toward an adult. A child would be much less likely to be arrested than an adult. So she felt that if we went about this the right way and we went about this peacefully, we were much more likely to have success. So that's why she decided to do this with children. Now, we would go through training. There's a church on Suckin and Stiles. It's called Calvary Baptist Church. So we would go to Calvary Baptist, which remind me, I got to say this. Everybody calls it the Deuce. When I was a kid, we never heard of the Deuce. It was Suckin Street, okay? It's Suckin Street. No, it was Suckin Street, okay? So stop that. So anyway, Calvary Baptist Church was at the top of the hill in fact, I'm sorry, it was Walnut Street, Suckin and Walnut. So we would go there and we would rehearse. There was another young lady in our group, Joyce Henderson. Joyce Henderson was our song leader. Joyce Henderson was our practice leader. And for whatever reason, Ms. Luper would kind of put her in charge all the time. Barbara Posey, who was the oldest, was actually the leader of the group. And so with the two of them and several others, that was kind of the way that it would go. When we first started doing the sit-ins, here again, we had problems with our parents. I literally had to slip away from home to go do a sit-in. Then my mother would say, and not my mother, lots of mothers would say, we are very concerned about our kids getting spit on, about our kids being called the N-word, about our kids being touched and hit. So sometimes we just would line up and go. There were probably about 200 or more kids that Mrs. Luper had that would participate from time to time. It wasn't always the same.
Yeah, excuse me, because I hear the original 13.
Let's talk about them.
And then you're saying it's 200. So
over time. You might remember that this went on from 1968 all the way through to about 1963, about that. So it was about
1958 to 1963, right?
Right.
Okay.
So there would be different kids at different times. And we weren't always there at the same time. Now let's talk about the original 13. The original 13, and I always have a sense of pride about the original 13 because there was no one before them. Which meant, like, when I got involved, at least we already had a pattern, if you follow what I'm saying. Those 13 did not have a pattern. They knew what to do, they went through the training, and they were there. So after they set the pattern of walking in quietly, sitting down, and saying, I want a hamburger and a Coke, we knew how to handle it from there because we'd had a group that had already gone there before and had started the pattern. So from that point on, it was a little bit easier for the rest of us. In fact, we kind of felt like that we were left out if we weren't in the first group. But the point was that Ms. Luper wanted to make sure that we were trained. She had groups of kids that she could lead and guide, and they would follow the instructions that we had. There was a guy in our community by the name of Portwood Williams. You ever heard of him?
Yeah.
Okay, you know he is Kanye's grandfather. Okay? Portwood was Ms. Luper's policeman.
And that's Kanye West.
Yes.
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 I'm sorry for those who don't know Kanye.
Okay.
Yes.
But Portwood Williams was like Ms. Luper's policeman. He would go down, and if he saw a kid was about to lose their temper, he would yank them out before they could interact with the white people, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Because people would come in, they'd curse at us, they'd spit on us, they'd push us, they'd hit us, all of that. And Ms. Luper had us trained not to react to those things. But you know yourself that sometimes the emotion will overcome all of that.
Sure.
So Portwood was the one that kind of made sure that if he saw us about to react, he would pull us out of there before we would overreact.
To your knowledge, where did Miss Looper learn the tactics that she taught you all at Calvary Baptist Church?
Well, first, let's start out with Miss Looper had tremendous standards. And she was, to me, when you start thinking about a leader, it's not somebody that's always hollering and saying, follow me and that kind of stuff. It's somebody that brings calmness to the situation, brings leadership through saying, this is what we need to do, and can break it down in such a way that people can see that what she's saying to do are the right things to do. I don't know whether, of course you don't know because you weren't around, but during that time, even among leaders in the black community, there were conflicts about what to do, how to do.
Who were those leaders?
For the most part, they were our ministers.
So we talked about Pastor Reed, but Pastor Reed was the junior. He wasn't the senior pastor.
Pastor Reed was just getting here that time.
Just getting here.
But I would talk about Reverend Alexander, Reverend Jackson. I can't remember who the pastor was at New Hope at that time, but the pastor at Tabernacle, there was also Reverend Perry. There was another Perry. It's kind of interesting. There were lots of Perrys around back then.
Yeah, far and few now.
Okay, but the pastors, and then you got to go into Roscoe Dungy, who I personally consider as the person that was really kind of the godfather of the sit-in movement in Oklahoma. There was a guy by the name of Jimmy Stewart, who I knew very, very well, that it kind of goes into another part of my life when I came back and I went to law school at OU. We now recognize that Ada Lloyd Scipio Fisher is not only the first African American to go to the University of Oklahoma, she was the first African American to go to any school in the South. This was a part of a strategy between the NAACP, starting with Thurgood Marshall. You might or might not know that Thurgood Marshall came to Oklahoma many times. And he took the case, Ada Lloyd Scipio Fisher versus Oklahoma University, with her to the Supreme Court. The story, I guess, to me, that really brings home to me is like Miss Scipio Fisher's father was also a bishop in the Methodist Church. He lived in Chickasha. He got to Chickasha because he was in the race massacre in Tulsa, and essentially got run out of town or got away from there, and he moved to Chickasha and he took his family there. And so later on, when Roscoe Dungy and Jimmy Stewart were looking for somebody to lead the integration of the colleges, which is another part. This was a step-by-step plan by the NAACP to change the integration, change the look of the United States, and which ended up with Brown versus Topeka in Kansas in 1954. But it started out with them deciding, let's start out with the colleges first. And so they started out on the East Coast, University of Maryland. They integrated the University of Maryland by getting someone in there. Then they went to Missouri and integrated someone there, except for the fact that the person that they had selected to go there disappeared. Nobody ever saw him. Once they accepted the fact they would take one, the guy disappeared. The likelihood is that he probably got killed or lynched or something like that, because that's the way it was back then. We're talking about 1947, 1948, 1949. Probably been 46, 47, 48 by then. So when it came to Oklahoma and Texas, Oklahoma, they picked Ada Lloyd Scipio Fisher, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. They picked a guy to go to the University of Texas at the same time. Texas decided that they were going to open a law school at Texas Southern. And there's a law school at Texas Southern right now called Thurgood Marshall College of Law. So that stopped them from having to integrate, because the issue was the Supreme Court says you got three options. You can bring the person into your law school, you can create another equal law school, or you can close down your law school. Those were the options that they gave Oklahoma and Texas. Oklahoma chose to create another law school. Oklahoma attempted that, but what happened was when Oklahoma attempted that, they created what was known as Langston University College of Law. It was the basement of the state capitol. Ada Lloyd Scipio Fisher decided that that was not acceptable. You can't have a law school with one person in it and two professors. So that's what they had. And so she said no. And so Thurgood Marshall and Ada Lloyd Scipio Fisher took the case back to the Supreme Court for the second time. And by then, Oklahoma says, we give, she can come to the University of Oklahoma. Both her and McLaren came approximately the same time, and both cases went up pretty much together. Along with the case versus, it's called Sweat versus Painter in Texas, at the University of Texas. What I really, really liked about the story was that when Jimmy Stewart and Roscoe Dungy, who were the presidents, one or the other of the state NAACP, went to the home in Chickasha, they went after Ada Lewis's brother. And the brother says, I just got through serving in World War II. I've been dealing with this crap my whole life. I don't want to mess with it. I'm leaving the state of Oklahoma. I'm going to Howard. So Ada Lewis was sitting there at the same time, and she just looked up and quietly said, I'll do it. She said, I'll do it. And when she said, I'll do it, they said, are you for real? She said, I'll do it. And so she became the person that was chosen at that moment to come to the University of Oklahoma and integrate it. When she got there, she applied. They says, you're qualified, but the law of the state of Oklahoma says we cannot have black kids and white kids in the same classroom. And that was a state law. So the president says, I'm telling you, you're qualified, but I can't accept you. So then they went to court about it to get the law changed. None of the local courts would change it. None of the under-level federal courts would do it. And so they ended up going to the Supreme Court. And in 1949, she was accepted into the University of Oklahoma. Not only was she the first person to go, she was also the first person to graduate. And I think that's important because it kind of goes back to my history of not being able to finish. She knew clearly what she wanted to do. She clearly had a support system. It wasn't the right support system, but she had a support system around her.
So she graduated from that law school when?
1952.
52, 6 years before the Cats sitting. Mm-hmm. So the civil rights movement was active at that time.
There's always been a civil rights movement, always. And it goes, I hate to say it this way, but it goes all the way back to Civil War. And after the Civil War, it kind of makes me get upset about it because after Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an edict, or as they would say now, a presidential executive order, which can be turned over anytime that the next president comes in, he forced through the 13th, and behind him, U.S. Grant was president, the 14th, 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves officially. The 14th was about civil rights, and the 16th was the bill that gave African Americans the right to vote. Now you get to 1872, and they had a compromise because they had a messed up, I won't say it was as bad as the one we had a couple of years, last year, but they had an issue with the presidential selection, so they made a compromise. The compromise was that, I can't remember, I want to say it was Harrison, but I don't think that's the right name of the president, says, okay, if you allow me to be elected, going through the Congress and all of that, I'll pull all of the troops out of the South and I'll stop Reconstruction. When they stopped Reconstruction, basically they gave to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and they started taking back the voting rights. At that time, 1873, 1872 in there, we had African-American senators, we had African-American congressmen, and so they started pulling all that back and taking the rights away. They took away the right to vote. All of this is called Jim Crow. They put separation back in place, and they started these sharecropping things that really in itself became slavery again. I know I'm off on a tangent, so okay.
No.
Then we come along, and there's certain things that are changing. Now I'm gonna go back to the 50s and the 60s. I mentioned the fact that in 1963, well, let's start with the fact that John F. Kennedy became president in 1960. In 63, he was assassinated. He was pushing civil rights at that time. He could not get them through. Once he was assassinated, that energy plus the power of President Johnson, a Southern president, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was the most significant legislation that's been passed in this country for civil rights since the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were passed between 1865 and 1868. So that was also the time that I grew up in. That's what I remember, and I remember that. And during that time, also, I'm growing up, and I just remember when Martin Luther King got killed, and that to me was the day I lost my hope. It's important that as we go through, and even as I talk to kids today, and I'm very much a Bible person, hope, faith, and love, if you read the Bible, are three of the most important characteristics a Christian should have. So if you lose your hope, that means you've lost all ability to force things through because you don't believe it's going to happen anyway. So here we are, we're fighting for civil rights. For me, it's from the late 1950s all the way through the 1960s. So I'm sitting at Oklahoma State in April of 1968, and I'm at my girlfriend's apartment. That's my wife now.
I hope that was Sandra.
I hope it was Sandra. And we were studying, and her roommate comes in and says, somebody killed Martin Luther King. And it was like my life fell apart. And I don't mean it in the sense that I couldn't breathe. It was like, okay, all these things we want out of our country, and I'm here as just a kid that's in college, and the man that's the most important man toward making these things happen, they killed him too. They killed him. So if they killed him, what does that say they care about the rest of us? So you sit there and you say, okay, why do I fight for this stuff when I know it's not going to happen? So you lost hope. It took me probably a year or so to get back to feeling like, okay, we still need to fight. Because when you lose your hope, you just like, I don't care no more. I just don't care because nothing's going to happen anyway. And I just remember feeling that way so bad. It was just like there was a big hole in my body that says, it's just not worth fighting for because it's not going to happen. But over time, we got other leaders. We continued to grow. I will also say that there were others that weren't African Americans that believed in where we were going and believed in what we were doing. And we need to understand that everything that I participated in as an African American to move things forward, there were whites with us all the way. Even in the sit-ins in Oklahoma City in 1958, there were whites with us. And I say that to understand that this is one country, and we need to operate and think to make this country a better country, a more unified country, and understand that what's right is right for everybody. So everybody needs to participate in the fight.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Already, I'm sorry.
I give speeches about Martin Luther King from time to time, and often people say, "Well, you can do that during Black History Report, and all the black people can go listen to that, and everybody else can go do something else." And that frustrates me because that's not true. Martin Luther King changed the country for everybody, not just for African Americans. I just want to say that before you.
No. In respect of that, saying that, that's why we want to thank you for coming today. You are a crown jewel to everyone, all people, to humanity. You're a crown jewel to the city. I was going to ask you that $1 million question you said leaders, and you mentioned the clergy. Calvary Baptist Church, historic church. Who was the pastor of that church during that time? Do you remember? And I should have asked you that earlier.
I remember his name, but
the reason I
hate to
asked,
say this, Reverend Calvary Baptist Church went through a bunch of ministers during that time.
because at that time, as you know as well as I, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was up for that.
He came in and applied for that position, and the church was not ready for Martin Luther King, and it was unfortunate. Or maybe it was fortunate, depending on how you want to look at it.
It was meant to be that way. Do you remember what year that was?
It was before, it was in the 50s. And I'll just, because it could have been about that same time. I know we talked about it, and especially when we started to see him rise in Alabama, and just saying that he could have been in Oklahoma City.
Speaking of Alabama and the South, Greensboro.
Yes.
Montgomery.
Yes.
Selma, all during that time. But Greensboro, number one, that sit-in they did at a cafeteria, or excuse me, at a restaurant counter, that counter sit-in seems to take precedent over the sit-in at Cats. We know from history and things that I've read and watched that the individuals from Greensboro came here to see what you all were doing.
Can I tell you about that?
I would love to hear that.
Okay. I was curious enough about it that I drove to Greensboro one day. One day, I was in the area, so I just went over. And I visited the counter. I visited the museum, a very, very nice museum. What happened is that they had 4 college students that had went to the NAACP state national meeting the year before. The way I was told, either at that meeting that year before or the meeting year before, one of those years, Miss Looper came there and gave a report on what was happening in Oklahoma. Also, the first civil rights movement that was done was not done in Oklahoma City. It was done in Wichita, Kansas. And so Miss Looper and the people in Wichita, Kansas worked very close to each other. So we quickly followed that pattern that they set up there. But getting back to Greensboro, they used college students, and it was, again, an NAACP group of students. It was 4, I don't remember their names, but there were 4 of them that kind of initiated it. And they did it essentially almost exactly the same way we did it. They walked in, they took all the seats, and they would sit there and study. And again said, I want a hamburger and a Coke. I think the reason that one became famous first was that sometimes I don't think we understand the role that media and marketing and publicity plays in some things. I think we understood it pretty good because Ms. Looper did get media to give her very positive coverage. She even got the police chief here in Oklahoma City to kind of, I don't want to say it wrongly, but to make sure that they more didn't start yanking people out of seats. I think she did get arrested something like 27 times, but...
It was documented right in that number.
Okay.
Yes.
But in Greensboro, they had a very, very supportive press there that really talked to their issue. And so they took advantage of the situation that was there. And since this happened in 58, or Oklahoma City happened in 58, and Greensboro happened in either 61 or 62, I'm not sure which year, they needed something to kind of light a fire. It's just like the lady's name on the bus.
Yes, Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks. That also, that didn't happen by accident.
Sure.
That had also happened in different places in the South, but that was done intentionally. It was done intentionally at that location so that we could build an incident so the country could see in a national way how some people that were fully members of this country were being treated.
Well, let's national way, international way, world way. May 25th, 2020. May 25th, 2020. The day that George Floyd was killed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember seeing the video of that, Mr. Floyd?
I remember seeing it, not live on TV, but right there.
What resonated with you when you saw that?
It wasn't up there with the day that Martin Luther King got killed because, again, it's a different time and a different place. And sometimes when I talk to my students about the sit-in movement or I talk about things that happen, they get upset about things that sometimes I'm like, I just don't get upset about. Like, for example, well, that's a good one. I don't ever think that I didn't get upset about Floyd. What I loved about it was that the media got it and took off with it. George Floyd wasn't even close to the first person that has happened to. It happened in a town where the police happened to have a kind of reputation of being that way, 1. 2, the media picked up on it because everybody and their brother in that neighborhood had a camera that day. And because everybody in their neighborhood, everybody and their brother had a camera that day, they got these pictures. I'm personally a word guy. I like to read things. I like newspapers much more than I like watching TV. And I must admit, even though I'm that way, the world is a little bit different. Sure. The world tends to like to see something in video. They like to be able to see it. And so when all these images came on TV, and you could sit there and watch this guy with his knee on that guy's neck for literally almost a minute, it just really, really gave such an image that it was so distasteful that the country as a whole says, I have to do something about it. Let's go back to one we didn't talk about. The bridge in Selma. What really made that was the picture of these guys coming across that bridge and then the sheriff's department beating them with sticks. To me, those things equate to essentially the same thing. There were so many people that saw that. There were so many people that were there that you couldn't cover it up. You couldn't hide it. One of the things that you think about is, okay, and it bothers me sometimes, was it fixed because it happened, or was it fixed because we were able to get it on TV? And, you know, frankly, most of the time it was fixed because we were able to get it on TV. But at the same time, these kind of things have been going on all the time. I get frustrated about that because that means our word of saying it happened wasn't good enough. But by the same token, if you can show it and you can't hide it, then it starts to become real. And see, to me, I haven't talked about the summer I spent in Birmingham, Alabama in 1966. One of my classmates went the summer before that. I can't remember exactly where he went, but the summer I went to Birmingham, Alabama, I went down there to sell Bibles door to door. And so we're in Birmingham, and it seems like almost every day we were there for the whole summer, people would refer to us at the N-word, especially the police. We'd go in restaurants, and they'd close the restaurant rather than serving us. This is in '66. And you sit there, and people would treat you so bad, or they'd stop our car and just make us take every single thing out of the car just because they could do it. If they saw more than 2 African Americans in a car, they would stop and search the car. And it sounds like you're in a war zone. You feel like you're in a war zone in your own country, but at the same time, you know that this is your country. You know, and I sit there and I got through that, and at the same time, that same summer, you got Watts going on in California. You got Detroit going on in Detroit. You got Washington. You got New York. You got all these riots. And being in Birmingham, dealing with what we were dealing with down there, it's like we didn't even know all the rest of the stuff was going on in the country because there was a news shutdown throughout the whole South to shut down the news. Like George Wallace, that year he had run out of term to be governor of the state of Alabama. So you know what he did? He ran his wife for governor, and she won. And so you have those things going on. It's such a disrespect to us as people that would cause you to feel, why do I even want to put up with this? And that leads you to think, you know, some of the people think we need to go back to Africa. I never thought that was a solution, but sometimes the frustration would make you feel like it's not going to happen here. Okay, looking from now to the incident last year, and in my life, I can see that there's a tremendous amount of forward movement. Yes. I can also see that there are opportunities. I also think that it's really, really, really important that we push education among our children, and we continue to keep our kids in schools as much as we possibly can, because that, to me, is the solution. And it's not, when I say our kids, I'm talking about the kids of the United States, not just the black ones.
Yeah. And Stan, if I could say this,
yeah.
George Floyd's movement, or the social justice movement of that terrible wrong, wasn't a United States movement. It was a world movement.
Yes.
Of all walks of life. Religions, hues, colors, didn't matter. People, humanity of good wanted that. And there's no question that occurred for the civil rights, because we wouldn't be here today if that didn't.
It showed America in a way that America was embarrassed to be seen, if that makes sense.
It does.
America, I love this country. I don't want to be anywhere else. I absolutely am where I want to be. I love Oklahoma. I don't want to be anywhere else. But at the same time, sometimes we have this feeling that we're so great that everybody else should be modeling after us, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So therefore, when we're put in a public embarrassing situation, it shocks us to the point where we decide to fix something.
How many years did you serve in the Army?
32.
32 years. You just gave an eloquent soliloquy of what has taken place in a very short window. of this time we've had, of what's taking place as you, as a black man, growing up and living in this country, raising a family, doing great for yourself and your community. And you served 32 years in the United States Army. Did you ever question that?
No.
Serving this country?
Let's go back to again. I went in the Army because, at least in my mind, I had no other choice. So let's start there. Now, I'm going in the Army. I flunked out of college. I screwed up my entire life, okay? There were sergeants that caused me to grow up, caused me to mature, and helped me and pushed me because they saw more in me than I saw in myself. All of them were not black. In fact, most of them were not black. But they pushed me because what they saw was they saw the potential in me, and they convinced me that I should go to school, back to school at night. I went to school at night for 10 years. I was 31 years old when I got a college degree. Then they pushed me to go to officer candidate school. Non-commissioned officers, sergeants, white and black, would say, you need to do this. Because what they were concerned about is, one, trying to make the Army better and trying to make our country better. So they're patriots. I don't consider the patriots that other people consider patriots. To me, patriots are people that are doing what they can to make the United States a better place for all people.
Yes.
And so, to me, that's a patriot. So they saw that they saw me and says, let's do what we can to make this person better. Sometimes they would kick me in the butt to get me to do something. Sometimes they would open a door so I could come through it. Going to officer candidate school is a massive door. Everybody doesn't get there. So they pushed me to go ahead and to do what I needed to do to get in there. I wasn't even thinking about going to officer candidate school. The only thing I wanted to do, truthfully, was get in the Army, get through that, avoid Vietnam, and come back. Now, the interesting thing was that later on, I went to Vietnam anyway.
That's what I thought you did.
Okay? And when I came to go into Vietnam, when it came time for me to go to Vietnam, I volunteered to go to Vietnam, which is kind of eerie because what had happened at that time, I was into my military career, and I said, I can see a path for success in the military. So if I'm going to do that, why don't I try to find out how really, really difficult it can be? So I came down on orders for Korea. And I went to my commander, and I says, is there a possibility I can get my orders changed to go to Vietnam? And he looked at me and said, why? I said, we've been talking about me staying in the military. Why don't I do the things that can tell me real quick whether I want to stay in the military or not? So he got my orders changed, and I went to Vietnam. And so that in itself talks to, I guess, understanding that we as a country, we as people need to think about, okay, how do we face challenges? Do we run from them or do we run toward them? I would like to think that we that are leaders in this country, and I consider you one of those, is that we have to be thinking about what are the challenges? And when I see them, do I look forward to them or do I hide from them? And so I really think we need to help people to understand that a challenge is something to look forward to, not something to run away from.
In closing, I want to talk about you. We talked about so many different people that we get a chance to touch on. John Green, Mr. Dow,
Yes.
Roscoe Dungy, Jimmy Stewart. I put Wayne Chandler Sr. in that
Yes, Wayne Chandler's in that group as well.
Those men, I had the great fortune of meeting at a younger age when I was younger.
Me too.
Freddie Williams.
Yes.
List goes on and on. And then I go back and reflect while we're here today. This is Black History Month, but every day's history, right? And I look at you, Stan. You in your career, you're the first African American to command Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to command a post.
Yes. No, not the first. I was the first one to command that post. And at the same time, that was the first one west of the Mississippi that was commanded by an African American.
Could you explain to me being the first dean of Command and General Staff College?
The Army Command and General Staff College is like a special college for mid-level officers. It's probably at the master's degree level for an outsider. It's a school that you pretty much have to go through if you're going to get to the higher levels of the military. And when I say it's like a master's degree, In the Army, we have what we call company grade, field grade, and senior grade. Company grade officers are the young officers that really work at the lower level of making sure things get done. The field grade officers are the officers that do the top staff work, that do it's kind of like, compare them with somebody that has an MBA and that are working at that particular level. So certain officers, probably about 1/3 to maybe not quite 1/2, are selected every year to go to that school once you reach the rank of major. But those are officers that are selected for follow-on career. And so if you get selected for that, it's a very substantial school, again, working at that level. But at the same time, it's one that you're looking for that, okay, how can I prepare an officer to be operating at what we would consider the higher staff levels? And then, like, my first job after I graduated was the Pentagon, right there. I went from there straight to the Pentagon. Because what they want to do is have officers that not only have the experience that the young officers have moving forward, but also to school you in a formal way so that you know what to expect and you know what to look for and you're trained to meet it when it comes your way.
You are also named Dean of Students for Oklahoma School of Law. You're the first Black African American to ever be a dean of any law school in the state of Oklahoma.
Let's talk about that a minute. Sometimes the door is open by somebody that, for lack of a better term, just gives a damn. I want to talk a minute about Andy Coates. Andy Coates was mayor of Oklahoma City. When he was mayor of Oklahoma City, he selected a guy by the name of Childers to be the Oklahoma City manager. That was the first
Terry Childers.
Terry Childers, that's his name. Terry became the first city manager in the history of the state of Oklahoma. When he went to the DA's office, there were no African Americans there. He became a DA. Within weeks, he had 2 African Americans in that office. Also, when he got there, he discovered that the Oklahoma City District Court had a system where African Americans were not allowed to participate in juries that were for serious crimes or murders. He made sure that that got taken out of the records and that African Americans were equally chosen for juries as the same as other people. He gets to OU Law and he says, okay, I'm looking for somebody that I can bring in here that I feel comfortable with that can do what I need, and he chooses me. So when I say we have to look for and understand that there are other people that will open doors for us if we prepare ourselves, I believe that because in my career, that's happened to me not only with Andy Coates, but several times in my career and in my life. Specifically, I saw it in the military, but I've seen it in my civilian life too. Give you an example. I used to cut grass when I was a kid in Nichols Hills. Okay, we go out there and cut these people's yards. So I'm a senior in high school and I graduate. This one guy comes to me, he says, for your graduation present, he's a white guy and we were cutting his yard. He said, I want you to go to any bookstore you want to go to and pick out any 3 books you want and bring me the receipt. And at first I didn't think nothing about it, but as I thought about it later on in life, I thought about what a door he opened for me by giving me the opportunity to get books rather than money or some other gifts. So what I do, when somebody graduates from high school now and they send me an invitation, I give them a copy of the U.S. Constitution. Wow. And I put a check inside of it. And the reason is I want them to understand what the baseline rules of this country are about. So everybody I give a Constitution, I can say I have that. The second thing is I can tell when the check clears my checkbook as to whether they read the book or not. Yes.
I was going to ask you that. But in closing, it's dynamic to hear a very snippet of your story. Mm-hmm. To allow us to get a moment in your mind and your life. Also to reflect back about the young people and the quality of people that were there in our movement for not just the city and state, but the nation. It has all come full circle for you, Stan. Mm-hmm. 2021, in the fourth quarter, you were selected and inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, State of Oklahoma Hall of Fame. The state of Oklahoma has embraced you and appreciates you. And, you know, this was a great moment for us, and I look forward to many of people watching this and listening to this, and I hope that we can get you back again.
You can have me anytime you want me, Kevin. You're one of my children, and that's the way I describe the people that I work with, that I try to open their eyes to and get them to see the larger future. And to me, the easiest way to become one of my children is to say you want to be, and then we start a dialogue. My goal really is, I've hit the peak of what I was going to do. In fact, I felt that when I was in the Army. So I'm down on the other side. What I'm really about now, and for the rest of my life, has to do with finding people that have great potential and helping them to get up to the top of the hill. You know the story of my daughter, which we didn't talk about, and I really want to come back because everything that I'm about is because of her. And my wife and I...
And we're speaking of Lee Evans.
Yes, Lee Evans. And you know her well because she and you started right here together.
Lee Evans and I both started in the broadcasting business, journalism business at the same time.
Yes. And she was killed in 1997 by a drunken driver. When she was killed, my wife and I were in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the Mall of the Americas. And you heard me talk about the fact that we do road trips. When I'm on a road trip with my wife, we visit malls around the country. She just wants to shop, so we'll go anywhere. And so literally, we were in Montana visiting my son, and we were coming back, and so we decided to take a detour and go through through Minnesota. So we're there, had a great day shopping, and we get back to the hotel, and there's all these phone messages. They're calling to tell us that our daughter had been killed by a drunken driver. So we're in Minnesota, and we're driving back to Oklahoma, and we're crying, we're upset. And as we're driving this way, we discovered that instead of there being 2 people in our car, there were 3 people in our car. There was me, there was my wife, and there was God. As God was talking us through this, he started talking about one of the things, be thankful for what you had, not be unjoyful about what you lost. It dawned on us that God had given us a great gift. He'd given Lisa Evans for 26 years. He could have gave that gift to someone else, but he gave it to us. So we were grateful, and we realized on that ride back here to bury her that what a great gift that God had given us. We also knew that one of the things, because you never know what God's plan is, but what we saw as our plan is he taught us with Lisa that people can become great. So what can we do other than to help create other Lisa Evans? So we decided from that moment for the rest of our lives, we were going to model ourselves, 1, after our daughter, who always was helping people, 2, never wasted a day, and 3, finding people that are willing to leap out and move forward. So we decided we were going to do everything we could to help every person we could help to move forward and to become a Lisa Evans. And so that, from that day to this, is what we've done, and that's how we've lived our life.
It's wonderful, and thank you for Lisa Evans. Dad, when she decided to crack the mic, she called herself Lee.
She did. Nope. It was kind of interesting because I remember Lisa had never lived in Oklahoma her whole life because we were in the military and she traveled. So she comes back to Oklahoma, and really the people that helped her make the decision, of course, the people at OU, but my dad and Jimmy Stewart. When she came back to visit OU, my dad took her over to see Jimmy Stewart, who was another one of our heroes.
Absolutely.
She just mentioned him that she was doing a paper on Ralph Ellison. And so Jimmy Stewart picked up the phone in his house and called Ralph Ellison in New York and put the 2 of them together.
Amazing.
And so she called me up later on that night and told me about it. And she says, if Oklahomans have this kind of power, maybe that's where I need to be.
What a story.
And so that helped her to kind of become a part of the OU family, which later on led to the next family, which was the Perry family, because Russell Perry basically plucked her out of college and gave her her first position, which was the news director of a brand new radio station.
Yes, she did.
And she took that and ran with it.
She did. She ran with it. And we cannot forget the creative one, Mr. Stan Evans himself. Photography, doing phenomenal in his field. Mm-hmm. He is working with Fortune 500 companies doing photography. Would you elaborate a little bit more on Stan?
First, I have a son that my daughter was more of the cosmopolitan person. The son was basically grew up in Alaska. If you ask him where he's from, he'll tell you he's from Alaska. But he fell in love with outdoor sports and just flat out being outdoors. So he chose photography solely so that he could continue to be outdoors every day.
Smart man.
So his accident turned into his profession. Stan has only had one job in his entire life. When he was a senior in college, he developed his own photography business, and he ran into a kid in Montana that was a world-class snowboarder, and Stan became famous by taking pictures of this guy and getting them into media. This kid became famous because Stan was taking pictures of him. And so both of them grew from there. And Stan's business grew to the point where Montana was not big enough. He moved to Salt Lake City. And then by then, the snowboard business was getting bigger, and he became one of the top photographers in his snowboard. Even today, he is considered as probably the top African-American outdoor photographer in the world. And so...
In the what, sir? In the what?
World.
In the world.
In the
Yes,
world.
I love
In the
that.
world.
Love that.
They have publicized him as being that. I mean, it's not just him saying it. You see all these magazines where you find his work. So, as a commercial, look up Stan Evans' photo on the internet, and you'll see all about him.
Excellent.
I'm the lesser famous Stan Evans.
Well, we appreciate you dearly. Love your story. We look forward to talking to you again some, and hopefully we can get Stan Evans Photography, Mr. Photo himself, and talk to him about what he's doing. But we want to say thank you for everything, and then moving forward and celebrating Black History Month, but celebrating not only Black History Month, Stan, but celebrating you. And thank you for everything.
Well, Kevin, I also have to thank you and you. Everything that's moving forward that has a star also has to have a foundation and a backbone. Perry Publishing, to me, is a part of the backbone, not only of Oklahoma City, but because of the reach that you have, is part of the backbone of this entire country. And so I just want to say that in ways that a lot of people don't even understand, you and your dad and your company are doing what our country needs to be done.
Well, thank you. Very, very kind. We do appreciate you. Until the next time, Stan.